The paycheck arrives every month like clockwork, deposited into my account by something called the Meridian Trust. $15,000 for 4 hours of work. All I have to do is show up at the Chapel of St. Vincent every third Saturday at 11:47 p.m. and follow 5 simple rules. Rule 1. Never look directly at the congregation during the service. Rule 2. Speak only the words written in the red prayer book. Rule 3. Ring the bell exactly 13 times before beginning. Rule 4. Keep the candles burning until the final prayer. Rule 5. Leave immediately when the service ends. Do not turn around. The job posting had appeared on a Tuesday morning, buried deep in the classified section of the newspaper. Seeking ordained minister for monthly religious service. Unique congregation. Excellent compensation. Discretion required. No phone number, just an address and a time to show up for the interview. I needed the money. My church had closed down 6 months earlier when the congregation dwindled to just me and Mrs. Kowalski, and she only came for the free coffee. The bills kept coming anyway. So I drove to the address that evening and found myself standing before a small stone chapel tucked between 2 vacant lots on Meridian Street. The woman who answered the door introduced herself as Sister Margaret. She wore modern clothes, just a simple black dress and cardigan, but something about her bearing suggested she had spent decades in religious service. Her hair was silver white and pulled back in a tight bun. Her eyes were pale blue and seemed to look right through me. "Father David Cross," I said, extending my hand. "I'm here about the position." She nodded and led me inside. The chapel was small but beautiful, with stained glass windows depicting saints I did not recognize. The altar was carved from dark wood and polished to a high shine. Rows of wooden pews faced forward, maybe enough seating for 50 people. "The position is simple," Sister Agatha explained as we walked down the center aisle. "Once a month you conduct a traditional Latin Mass for our congregation. The service lasts exactly 1 hour. You will be paid well for your time." "What denomination is the congregation?" "We follow the old ways," she said. "The congregation has been meeting here for over a century. They are very set in their traditions." She handed me a leather-bound prayer book with a red cover. The pages were thick and yellowed with age. The text was in English, written in an old-fashioned style. It seemed like a standard Catholic Mass, though some of the prayers were unfamiliar to me. "There are 5 rules you must follow exactly," Sister Margaret continued. "These rules are not suggestions. They are requirements for your safety and the safety of others." She explained each rule carefully, making me repeat them back to her twice. When she was satisfied that I understood, she walked me to the door. "Your first service is this Saturday. Arrive at 11:47 p.m. precisely. The congregation will already be seated. Begin the service at midnight." I wanted to ask more questions, but something about her manner suggested the interview was over. The next morning, I found a contract in my mailbox, along with a cashier's check for $15,000. The contract was simple. 1 page, no fine print. I signed it and deposited the check. That first Saturday, I arrived at the chapel at 11:45 p.m. The front door was unlocked. I stepped inside and heard the soft murmur of voices coming from the main sanctuary. The congregation was already there, just as Sister Agatha had promised. I walked to the small preparation room behind the altar and put on the white vestments that had been laid out for me. The clock on the wall showed 11:52. At 11:58, I picked up the brass bell from the table and stepped through the doorway onto the altar. The sanctuary was full. Every pew was occupied by men and women of various ages, all dressed in dark clothing. They sat perfectly still, facing forward. I kept my eyes focused on the red prayer book as I had been instructed. At exactly midnight, I rang the bell 13 times. The sound echoed through the chapel, clear and sharp. I opened the prayer book and began to read. "In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit." The congregation responded in unison, their voices joining together in perfect harmony. I had been to thousands of church services in my 23 years as a priest, but I had never heard a congregation speak with such unity. Every voice matched perfectly in tone and timing. I continued with the opening prayers, reading directly from the book. The formal English flowed smoothly, and the congregation responded to each call exactly as they should. Their timing was flawless. When I paused, they paused. When I spoke, they answered. The service proceeded normally for the first 30 minutes. I read the prescribed prayers and the congregation responded appropriately. But as we approached the halfway point, I noticed something odd about their responses. They were speaking too quickly. I would finish a line, and before I could take a breath, the congregation would begin their response. Not just quickly, they were starting before I actually finished speaking, as if they knew exactly when each word would end. I tried to vary my pace slightly, slowing down on some phrases and speeding up on others, but no matter how I changed my rhythm, their responses began at exactly the right moment. They were not reacting to my words. They were anticipating them. During the reading of the gospel, I made a small mistake and skipped a line. Without missing a beat, the congregation responded as if I had read the missing line correctly. They gave the response that should have followed the words I had not spoken. My hands began to shake slightly as I held the prayer book. I wanted to look up, to see their faces, to understand how they knew the words I had not said. But Rule 1 was clear: never look directly at the congregation during the service. I forced myself to focus on the red book and continue reading. We moved through the communion prayers without incident. The congregation's responses remained perfectly timed, perfectly coordinated. When we reached the final blessing, I spoke the closing words and made the sign of the cross. "Go in peace to love and serve the Lord." "Thanks be to God," they responded in unison. The service was over. Following Rule 5, I closed the prayer book, blew out the candles, and walked directly toward the preparation room without turning around. I did not look back at the congregation. I changed out of the vestments as quickly as possible and left through the rear door. The next morning, another check for $15,000 was in my mailbox. For the next 3 months, the services followed the same pattern. I would arrive at 11:47, conduct the Mass, and leave immediately afterward. The congregation's responses were always perfect, always anticipating my words by just a fraction of a second. I learned to ignore this oddity and focus on reading the prayers correctly. The money was too good to question, and the work was easy enough. I told myself that some congregations were simply more practiced than others. Maybe they had been reciting the same Mass for so many years that they had memorized not just the words, but the exact timing. On my 4th month, something changed. I arrived at the usual time and prepared for the service as normal. The congregation was already seated when I stepped onto the altar at midnight. I rang the bell 13 times and opened the red prayer book. But this time, there was no response. The chapel was completely silent. I waited for several seconds, thinking perhaps they had not heard me clearly. I repeated the opening line. Still nothing. I stood at the altar, prayer book in hand, staring down at the pages. The congregation sat in their pews, but they were not responding to the prayers. I could hear them breathing. A soft, rhythmic sound like waves against a shore. I continued with the service, reading each prayer and waiting for responses that never came. The silence was unsettling, but I remembered the rules. Rule 2 was to speak only the words written in the red prayer book. It said nothing about stopping if the congregation did not respond. For 45 minutes, I conducted a one-sided Mass. I read every prayer, performed every ritual, gave every blessing. The congregation sat in perfect stillness throughout the entire service. When I reached the final words, I closed the book and followed Rule 5. As I walked toward the preparation room, I heard something that made me freeze in place. Applause. Slow, measured clapping was coming from the sanctuary behind me. It started with just one person, then two, then the entire congregation was applauding. The sound echoed off the stone walls of the chapel. I wanted to turn around and see what was happening, but Rule 5 was absolute. I forced myself to keep walking, changed out of the vestments, and left through the rear door. My hands were shaking as I drove home. The check arrived the next morning as usual. The 5th month brought another change. This time, when I began the service, the congregation responded to the prayers, but they were speaking different words. I would say, "Lord, have mercy," and they would respond with what sounded like English, but not English I recognized. The words had the same rhythm and cadence as the traditional responses, but the syllables were wrong. It was as if they were speaking some other language that only resembled English. By the 6th month, their responses had changed completely. They were no longer speaking words at all, but producing sounds, low humming noises that rose and fell with the rhythm of the prayers. The humming was perfectly coordinated, creating harmonies that seemed to resonate in my chest. I began to dread the monthly services, but the money kept coming, and I needed it. I had tried to find other work, but churches were closing all over the city. The few that remained open were not hiring. The Chapel of St. Vincent was my only source of income. During the 7th month, I made my first serious mistake. We were halfway through the service when I heard a sound from the congregation that was different from their usual humming. It was a single voice, speaking what sounded like my name. Not Father Cross or David, but my childhood nickname that only my family had ever used. Davy. The voice was soft and female, and it sounded exactly like my sister Sarah, who had died in a car accident 15 years earlier. Without thinking, I looked up from the prayer book. The pews were empty. Every single seat in the sanctuary was vacant. The chapel was completely deserted, except for me standing at the altar with the red book in my hands. But the humming continued, coming from somewhere I could not see. I quickly lowered my eyes back to the book, but the damage was done. I had broken Rule 1. For the rest of the service, the humming grew louder and more complex, building into harmonies that seemed to come from the walls themselves. When the service ended, I practically ran to the preparation room. As I changed out of the vestments, I could hear movement in the sanctuary, footsteps, whispered conversations, the sound of people leaving through the front door. But when I had looked up, there had been no one there. I decided that the 7th month would be my last. I would conduct one more service and then find some way to break the contract. The money was not worth the growing sense that something was fundamentally wrong with the Chapel of St. Casimir and its congregation. But when I tried to contact Sister Margaret to give my notice, I discovered that the phone number on my contract was disconnected. I drove to the chapel during the day and found it locked, with no sign of anyone around. I checked with the city records office and learned that the Chapel of St. Vincent was not listed as an active religious institution. According to their files, the building had been abandoned for over 30 years. Yet the services continued, and the checks kept coming. I started researching the chapel's history at the city library. What I found explained everything and nothing at the same time. The Chapel of St. Vincent had been built in 1894 by a group calling themselves the Order of the Silent Vigil. They were Catholics, but they practiced a very unusual form of worship. According to the newspaper archives, they believed that traditional prayer was too loud and disruptive for proper communication with God. The order developed their own version of the Mass that was supposed to be conducted in complete silence. They thought that if they could pray without making any sound at all, their words would reach God more directly. The idea was that human voices created too much noise and interference. But there was a problem with their theory. Silent prayer meant that no one could participate together as a congregation. So they came up with a solution that seemed clever at the time. They would hire a priest to speak the prayers out loud, while the congregation would pray the responses silently in their minds. The newspaper article from 1923 described how the order had grown to about 40 members who met monthly for these silent masses. The hired priest would read all the prayers and responses, essentially conducting both sides of the service, while the congregation sat quietly and focused their thoughts on God. Everything seemed fine for almost 30 years. Then, in 1924, something went wrong. According to the police report I found, the hired priest at that time was Father William Garrett. On the night of March 15, 1924, Father Garrett arrived at the chapel for the monthly service as usual. The next morning, he was found dead at the altar, still wearing his vestments. The strange part was that there were no signs of violence and no obvious cause of death. The coroner ruled it a heart attack, but Father Garrett was only 32 years old and had been in perfect health. Even stranger, the congregation was nowhere to be found. The chapel was empty except for the priest's body. The police investigated, but none of the order members could be located. It was as if they had all vanished at the same time. The chapel sat empty for several months until the city took it over for unpaid taxes. But the story did not end there. In 1925, the city hired a caretaker to maintain the building while they decided what to do with it. The caretaker, a man named Thomas Pike, reported strange occurrences. He said he could hear voices coming from the chapel at night, even though the building was locked and empty. Pike lasted 3 months before he quit. His replacement, Robert Mills, reported the same thing. He said it sounded like a church service was being conducted inside, complete with prayers and responses, but whenever he unlocked the door to investigate, the chapel was vacant. The city went through 6 caretakers in 2 years. Finally, they decided to just abandon the building altogether. The Chapel of St. Vincent officially closed in 1927. I found more records from the 1950s, when a development company tried to buy the property. Their surveyor, a man named Howard Fleming, spent several nights in the chapel to assess its condition. According to his report, he heard the same thing the caretakers had described, the sound of a complete church service coming from the main sanctuary. But Fleming was more curious than the others. On his 3rd night, he decided to investigate more thoroughly. He hid behind the altar and waited to see what would happen. At midnight, he reported, the chapel began to fill with people. He could hear them walking down the aisles, taking their seats in the pews, whispering to each other before the service began. But when he looked out from behind the altar, he could not see anyone. The service proceeded normally, with a priest reading prayers and a congregation responding in unison. Fleming said the voices were clear and distinct, coming from all around the sanctuary, but the pews remained empty. When the service ended, Fleming heard the congregation leaving, footsteps, conversations, the sound of the front door opening and closing. Then the chapel was silent again. Fleming included a recommendation in his report that the building should never be used for any purpose. The development company decided not to purchase the property. I found similar stories from the 1960s and 1970s. Urban explorers, homeless people seeking shelter, teenagers looking for a place to party. They all reported hearing the same phantom church service. Some people claimed they had been invited to participate. One account from 1978 particularly caught my attention. A young man named Daniel Rivers had broken into the chapel on a dare from his friends. He wrote about his experience in a letter to the editor of the local newspaper. Rivers said that when he entered the chapel, he found a red prayer book lying open on the altar. He heard a voice telling him to begin the service. Not knowing what else to do, he started reading from the book. According to Rivers, an invisible congregation responded to every prayer he read. He could hear their voices clearly, but could not see anyone in the pews. The service lasted exactly 1 hour. When it ended, Rivers said he felt compelled to leave immediately without looking back. The next day, Rivers found an envelope under his door containing $500 in cash. I found at least 12 other similar accounts over the decades. In 1983, a homeless veteran named Marcus Webb had taken shelter in the chapel during a snowstorm. He reported the same experience, finding the Red Book, hearing the voice, conducting a service for an invisible congregation. Webb used the money he received to get back on his feet and eventually became a successful carpenter. In 1991, a college student named Jennifer Hayes had entered the chapel as part of a thesis project on abandoned religious buildings. She ended up conducting 3 monthly services before deciding to stop. In her thesis, she wrote that the experience had been deeply moving and had convinced her to change her major from psychology to theology. The most detailed account came from 1995. Dr. Patricia Morse, a psychiatrist specializing in religious experiences, had heard the stories about the chapel and decided to investigate. She approached it as a scientific study, bringing recording equipment and keeping detailed notes. Dr. Morse documented 6 months of services. Her recordings captured only her own voice reading the prayers, but her notes described hearing full congregation responses every time. She wrote that the voices seemed to come from specific locations in the pews, and that over time she began to recognize individual vocal patterns. What struck me most about Dr. Morse's account was her description of how the experience changed her. She wrote that conducting the services gave her a sense of peace and purpose she had never found in her regular psychiatric practice. By her 6th month, she was considering leaving her job to pursue religious studies. Then she simply stopped going. In her final notes, Dr. Morse wrote only, "I understand now why people choose to stay. I must leave while I still can." Reading these accounts, I realized that the Order of the Silent Vigil had been trying to recruit new members for over 70 years. They were not just looking for someone to read prayers. They were looking for someone who would eventually join them permanently. That was when I understood what was happening. The Order of the Silent Vigil had not vanished in 1924. They had achieved exactly what they had been trying to do. They had learned to pray without making any physical sound, without taking up any physical space. They had become pure voice, pure intention, but they still needed someone to speak the other half of the Mass, the priest's part. That was why they kept hiring people like me. We were providing the missing piece of their worship service. The congregation had not been anticipating my words because they were psychic or supernatural. They had been responding before I spoke because they were not responding to my voice at all. They were having their own conversation with God, and my words were irrelevant to them. When I had broken Rule 1 and looked up during the 7th month, I had seen the truth. The pews were empty because the congregation was not physical. They existed as voices, as intentions, as the pure spirit they had been seeking for over a century. And they were still meeting every month, still conducting their silent vigil, still trying to reach God through their perfected prayer. I realized that I had 2 choices. I could stop showing up and break the contract, which would leave them without a priest again. Or I could continue providing the service they needed, knowing now what I was really doing. The money was still good. The work was still easy. And now that I understood what was happening, it did not seem frightening anymore. It seemed almost beautiful in a way. These people had dedicated their lives to prayer, and death had not stopped them from continuing their worship. I decided to keep the job. For the next year, the services continued normally. I would arrive at 11:47 p.m., conduct the Mass, and leave at exactly 1 a.m. The invisible congregation responded to every prayer with perfect timing. Sometimes I could hear individual voices, men, women, even children. They sounded peaceful and content. I stopped trying to anticipate their responses or wonder about their true nature. I simply read the prayers from the Red Book and let them handle their side of the conversation with God. But during my 2nd year, I started to notice changes in myself. At first, it was small things. I found myself thinking in the rhythms of the prayers from the Red Book. When I spoke to people during the day, I would sometimes pause in the middle of sentences, as if waiting for a response that never came. I also began having vivid dreams about the chapel. In these dreams, I could see the congregation clearly. They were ordinary people from different time periods, some dressed in clothes from the 1920s, others from more recent decades. They would smile at me and nod encouragingly as I conducted the service. The dreams felt more real than my waking life. I would wake up feeling refreshed and peaceful, as if I had actually spent time with close friends. During the day, I found myself looking forward to sleep just so I could return to the chapel in my dreams. Then I realized that I was starting to mumble the congregation's responses along with them during the services. I would read my line, and then my lips would move silently as they gave their response. I was learning their part of the Mass without meaning to. My daily life began to feel strange and disconnected. Conversations with living people seemed forced and artificial compared to the natural flow of the chapel services. I stopped watching television, stopped reading newspapers, stopped caring about current events. The only thing that felt real and important was the monthly service. I started arriving at the chapel earlier each month. Instead of showing up at 11:47 p.m., I would arrive at 11 p.m. and spend the extra time sitting in the sanctuary, feeling the presence of the congregation as they gathered. I could sense them taking their seats, greeting each other silently, preparing for worship. During my 18th month, I began staying after the service ended. Instead of leaving immediately as Rule 5 required, I would sit in the back pew for a few minutes and listen to the congregation as they departed. I could hear their footsteps, their whispered conversations, their quiet laughter. No one seemed to mind that I was breaking Rule 5. In fact, the congregation seemed pleased that I was staying longer. Sometimes I would hear individual voices speaking to me directly, thanking me for my service or commenting on how well I had read a particular prayer. By the end of my second year, I knew their responses so well that I could anticipate them perfectly. I found myself speaking slightly ahead of their voices, the way they had once spoken ahead of mine. I also began to understand the deeper meaning behind the prayers in the Red Book. They were not just standard church liturgy. They were carefully crafted invitations for the living to join the community of eternal worship. Each prayer contained layers of meaning that only became clear after months of repetition. During my 24th month, something remarkable happened. I was reading the final prayers of the service when I realized that I could not hear the congregation responding anymore. The chapel was silent, but I could feel their presence more strongly than ever before. It was as if they were speaking directly into my mind instead of using their voices, and I was responding the same way. For the first time since I had started working at the Chapel of St. Vincent, I was participating in a truly silent Mass. No words were spoken aloud, but the prayers continued perfectly. I could sense every response, every amen, every moment of shared reverence. When the service ended, I understood what had been happening to me. I was becoming like them. The realization should have been terrifying, but it was not. I felt calm and clear, as if I had finally found the purpose I had been searching for my entire life. The Order of the Silent Vigil had not been trying to harm me. They had been trying to save me. All those years of conducting services for dwindling congregations, of watching churches close and communities scatter, I had been witnessing the end of something beautiful. But here, in this little chapel, that beauty continued unchanged. I could join them, and my voice would become part of their eternal vigil. Or I could remain as I was, serving as their connection to the physical world. I made my choice that night. I continued conducting the monthly services for 6 more months, but now I was no longer just reading the prayers. I was leading a congregation that included my own spirit, my own voice, my own dedication to reaching God through perfected prayer. On my 30th month, I conducted my final service as a living priest. I arrived at 11:47 p.m. as always, put on the vestments, and took my place at the altar. But instead of opening the red prayer book, I set it aside and spoke from memory. I led the congregation through every prayer, every response, every moment of the Mass without reading a single word. We moved together as one voice, one intention, one perfect expression of faith. The service that night was different from all the others. I could feel the congregation's excitement and anticipation. They knew what was about to happen, and they were welcoming me home. As I spoke the final blessing, I felt a warmth spreading through my chest, as if my heart was expanding to hold more love than I had ever thought possible. The words flowed from me effortlessly, and I knew that I was speaking not just with my own voice, but with the collective voice of everyone who had ever found peace in this chapel. When the service ended, I did not leave through the rear door. Instead, I walked down from the altar and took a seat in the front pew. For the first time since I had started working at the Chapel of St. Vincent, I turned around and saw my congregation. They were exactly as I had imagined them. 43 men, women, and children, dressed in the simple clothes of their time, their faces serene and peaceful. They welcomed me with smiles and small nods of recognition. I could see the original members of the Order of the Silent Vigil from 1924, still wearing the formal clothes they had died in. There was Father William Garrett, the first priest who had joined them, looking young and healthy. Dr. Patricia Morse sat in the third row, no longer struggling with her decision. Daniel Rivers was there, along with Marcus Webb, Jennifer Hayes, and all the others who had chosen to stay. Sister Margaret was there, looking exactly as she had when I first met her. She handed me a red prayer book and pointed to the altar. "Your turn to rest," she said gently. "We have found someone new." I looked up and saw a young woman in white vestments standing behind the altar. She looked nervous but determined. In her hands was another red prayer book, and she was reading the first prayer of the Mass. Her name was Sister Elizabeth Sterling, though she probably did not know that we already knew everything about her. She had been ordained just 2 years earlier and was struggling to find work after her church had closed due to financial difficulties. She had seen the same classified ad that had brought me here, and she needed the money just as desperately as I had. "In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit," she said. "Amen," we responded in unison. As the service continued, I watched Sister Sterling with the same mixture of hope and patience that the congregation had once shown me. She would make the same journey I had made, discover the same truths I had discovered, and eventually make the same choice I had made. But that would take time. For now, she was simply a young priest conducting a monthly service for what appeared to be an empty chapel. She would go home afterward with $15,000 and no real understanding of what she had participated in. Over the coming months, she would notice the perfect timing of the congregation's responses. She would realize that they were anticipating her words. She would break Rule 1 and see empty pews while hearing full voices. She would research the chapel's history and piece together the truth. And eventually, she would understand that she was not just conducting a service, but participating in something eternal and beautiful. The service ended, and Sister Sterling followed Rule 5 perfectly, leaving immediately without looking back. The congregation began to disperse, chatting quietly among themselves as they headed toward what appeared to be empty air, but was actually the entrance to a realm beyond the physical chapel. The service continued, and I settled back into my pew with a sense of complete contentment. I had found my place in the eternal vigil, and the Order of the Silent Vigil had found their new priest. The arrangement worked perfectly for everyone involved. The monthly checks continued to be deposited into accounts around the city. New priests arrive when the old ones join the congregation. The 5 rules remain the same, and they are always followed exactly, because some things are too important to change, and some prayers are too perfect to end.